All right, hello everybody. We are back for Chapter 5 of Locke's second treatise of government. Now, this chapter is titled Of Property, and it basically is trying to establish, how do I put this, how property works in a pre-societal state, as well as some caveats for how property works post the establishment of society, of government. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, the basis for Locke's theory of property is that men have the right of self-preservation. Therefore, they must needs have at least certain rights of private property, such as the right to own meat and water, clothing, that kind of stuff to keep themselves going. He notes, and this is something that Rothbard gets to early on in his theory of property, but he notes that requiring the permission of all mankind in order to own and therefore to consume any particular good is something that can only lead to paralysis or even starvation, right? If I need everyone's permission to eat an apple that I've picked off of a tree, then I can't ever get that permission in a realistic way. We're left with either the possibility that there is some kind of like overall owner of all things, or that people have some kind of right to private property. And as Locke used his first treatise to discuss, there's no clear division between one person and another to show that person A is of the owner class and person B is of the non-owner class. And so therefore, Locke posits that there's some kind of universal right to private property for people. And because God gave the world to Adam and his heirs, that is, humanity, we have the right to own property within that world. So, in the state of nature, in a natural state where there's no agreed upon rules of property, goods exist in a natural state, at least some goods exist in a natural state as unowned objects, a tree with fruit on it, for instance. They exist in what Locke is going to call the commons. Now, the basis for your private property comes from your ownership of yourself. And this is weird because Locke has used the locution that you are owned by God, therefore you cannot destroy yourself, right? This is something that he said earlier in the book. And now he kind of shifts to say that man has property in his own person by way of his right and need to self-preserve himself. It's weird, right? Because the lack of a right to destroy oneself, the right of self-preservation comes from man's ownership by God, right? And now Locke has kind of changed his tune a little bit, and he's saying that you have property in your own person. Let me get the actual quote out just to get it just right. But yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. So the phrase "has a property" is interestingly vague or interestingly reserved in the sense that it does not say that man has full self-ownership, but that he has some property rights in himself. Again, this is because Locke is attributing the rest of those property rights in man to God. At least that's my interpretation of what he's saying. It is man's responsibility to God to preserve his being to the best of his abilities, and therefore he must also have some property in his labor that no other man has property in. God might, but not other men. So, Locke posits that mixing your labor with goods that are in the commons is a primitive, law of state of nature way to bestow a property, private ownership vis-a-vis other men to yourself in certain goods. So again, if I pick the apple off of the tree, then that apple becomes my property because I've mixed my labor with the apple. It becomes mine. Locke then also notes that men in society create laws to control property rights once they build a society together, right? Commons still exist, for instance, the oceans, but in general, the land is part of or owned by a state or government, and those what used to be commons are now the property of a government, of a society. They may still have commons in a certain sense within those areas, but those commons, generally speaking, are restricted to the people who are part of that country. They are no longer open commons to the world. They are open commons by compact to the other people that are in that particular society. So, for instance, there might be, public spaces in Britain where there are trees that have fruit that you can eat, and that's allowed. But those are the property of the society, and by compact they have put those as commons, but commons restricted to that specific society. Of course, there's also the possibility that a society could also decide to hold in common certain things just as commons for anybody who happens to walk in. This is where Locke's perception or understanding or position on like people moving into and out of different societies becomes a little bit more important. We're not there yet, so we're going to get there eventually, but it's worth noting that this is something that he's trying to grapple with. It's interesting here that Locke is kind of conspicuously failing to mention cases where the laws might be, where these positive laws that society creates might be dubiously connected to the laws of nature. And again, the laws of nature are not the rules by which man in the state of nature necessarily... His definitions are so weird, right? Because the law of nature is something that can be derived from God and from an attention to reason. And in Locke's parlance, man's primeval state is a combination of the state of nature and the state of war, right? And the purpose of government is to minimize the state of war between people that are in that society, to effectively, create the laws of nature in that society. But the actual laws of nature are not fully known, right? There's something that we have to figure out by way of reason, and people can have different interpretations of what the laws of nature are. And in fact, these positive declarations, these legislations, these laws that societies create might not, in all cases, coincide with the law of nature. The point is that the government exists as a common higher power in order to mediate disputes, so that people don't have to resort to entering into the state of war with each other, to minimize that state. But so the question is, what do we do with kind of ambiguous positive laws that societies make? And Locke is still pretty quiet about that at this point. It's one of those things that I think he might be digging himself into a bit of a hole here. We're going to see if he manages to get himself out of it as we go through the book. So, there is an interesting caveat to property rights that Locke explains here, and that is something else that he derives from kind of a religious perspective. It's that there is no right to appropriate goods that you then waste. A person can pick an apple to eat the apple, but if a person picks 1,000 apples and carries them in a big pile until they all rot, then that person has committed a violation of the law of nature, and that property is not actually actually his in the state of nature. You can't waste things. You can't be especially wasteful, because by Locke's perspective, God didn't create these things to be wasted. God created them to be used for the betterment of humanity. And therefore, you can't, if you waste them, you are taking away from someone who otherwise would have had the opportunity to make use of the stuff that you took and wasted. This is a very old school perspective, right? Like, the idea that things exist because God put them there for our benefit leads to the belief that waste is not permitted. But again, this is one of those very fuzzy things, like, how to put this. It is true at this point that the average Englishman was not using every part of the buffalo or the meat cow, for instance. And so it's a question of, and of course there might be people who don't know how to use a particular part of something that they take out of the commons. You might, does failing to plant the seeds of the apple that you picked count as wastefulness? Again, this is one of those things that's a little bit fuzzy, and it's one of those things where if I don't intend, for instance, how do we get around this, right? Or how do we deal with this? Let's assume we're in the state of nature and not in the state of war with somebody. If I pick an apple and eat the apple and I have the core still left, and someone says, "Can I have those apple seeds?" then under this kind of theory of property, if I don't intend to plant those apple seeds, then the person who wants to plant the apple seeds gains a right of property, or at least it seems like they might gain a right of property in those seeds because I intend to waste them. Similarly, if someone sees that I have more apples than I could possibly eat before they go bad, is there an obligation created to give them a portion of what I have, taken command of? Since there's no higher power to mediate that dispute, how does that work exactly? It's a little funny here. And I think it's worth noting that this is a little bit vague and a little bit fuzzy. And vagueness and fuzziness are two of our biggest enemies here, because again, we're trying to create a system that is different from pure voluntarism, pure anarchism, and different from totalitarian government. And the more fuzzy we create, the more fuzzy Locke is, the more likely it is that whatever system he creates is going to end up as either anarchy or totalitarianism. So that's, I think, worth thinking about. Then Locke starts to get into property and land, and here I think he is making not a mistaken, but an overly optimistic assumption. Because what he says is that there's a natural limit to mankind's property and land while in the state of nature. Basically, that you are limited to what you can till, plant, cultivate, improve, enclose. Now, one of the things about this that kind of bugs me is that it ignores like a tendency for a person for people to aim towards conquest, right? That's another one of the things that we want to try to avoid. We want to try to avoid having a system where one group A, dominates Group B and turns that into some kind of caste system. Basically, since Locke has gone to the difficulty and the work of showing that there's no natural distinctions between people as far as their natural rights go, it would be strange to allow a system to exist within the Lockean framework where Group A dominates Group B, and yet somehow this is also seen as a lawful society, right? And so I'm wondering if he's being a little too optimistic here about people, because there's differences in like how much work goes into mixing your labor with land in different ways. Like if you're going to take command of a herd of animals that happens to live in a particular area, right? And you're going to follow them around. Clearly, you don't own all of the land that those animals walk around occasionally. You might own the herd, right? But you also can't own the herd in a meaningful way in the state of nature, because there's no way for you to like mix your labor with the animals. Like, is just watching an animal mixing your labor with it? Probably not. But this is one of those things where we're basically creating disputes that, by definition, since we're in the state of nature, and or in the primeval state where we're in a mix of state of nature and state of war, there's no higher authority to go to say, well, I own this herd. I've been following them around and keeping track of them, and that therefore the herd is mine. Similarly, it's much easier to simply fence off land than it is to actually cultivate it. And so you end up with some weird incentives here to like put a fence around the biggest chunk of land that you can and say, I've enclosed it, now it is mine. And that can lead to situations where a lot of land doesn't get tilled because it is owned by someone who has simply enclosed it and doesn't intend to actually till the land. Locke tries to kind of get around this by, it's almost like a limited and again kind of vague reference to like almost squatters' rights, that if there is land that is enclosed but left to waste, right? He uses the word waste as in waste land frequently in this section, in this chapter. And one of the things he talks about is how under certain cases it may be acceptable for a person to start to find a piece of land that is enclosed but neglected, and then start tilling that land, and then maybe they can get some kind of property right in that land. It's one of those things that pops up in the middle of this chapter and is a little strange. And it's one of those things where it doesn't make a lot of sense for it to exist in the state of nature because there's no one to arbitrate, to mediate that dispute if one arises. The other point that Locke makes here is that appropriation from the commons, generally speaking, in the state of nature, has to leave enough and as good as was there before you appropriate it. And this is another thing that's very hard to quantify, right? Let's say that there are only 100 apple trees, right, in an area, and that there are 1,000 people who live in that area as well, in kind of a reasonably peaceful but not structured state of nature, right? There is some point at which I could, live entirely off of apples, right? And at some point, the amount of apples that I'm eating is going to be a significant fraction of the harvest of those 100 trees. And so now we've created another potential dispute where someone can say, you, sir, have taken more than your natural apportionment of these apples because there are not enough left. All of the apples that you took were the ones on the lower branches, and now all the ones on the higher branches, we all have to work harder for those. When you're creating this kind of philosophical basis for government, for self-government, for state of nature, you really need to avoid this kind of wishy-washy language. At least this is my position on it, because if you don't write things down explicitly, then you end up in a state where someone is simply going to take the authority and run with it. In this case, what we have is the possibility of people having disputes over what enough and as good left means. So again, this is one of those cases where again Locke is creating situations where man will transition from a state of nature to a state of war because of these disputes, and he's not really giving it a lot of time to discuss the ramifications of these disputes moving into the state of war. It's one of those things where the way that this is being argued is a little bit disjointed in time, because Locke's chapter on conquest is actually way at the end of the book, and so it's going to be a while until we get those answers, assuming that they make sense. But anyway, let's keep moving. One of the interesting things here that Locke does is he has this very clear recognition of the unproductivity or the minimal productivity of the commons as commons by themselves. He notes that cultivated land, whether cultivated to farm or cultivated by the building of a factory on that land or whatever is much, much more productive than having it be open and having people just kind of pick the things that are on it and take them individually to their own property. He says that it's not unusual for properly cultivated land to be 10 times or even 100 times more productive than the same size of land with the same quality of soil that's just kind of left out to the commons. This is an early recognition of the tragedy of the commons as well, but in reverse. Because what he says is that because productively cultivated land is so much more productive, that the natural tendency should be to encourage the cultivation of land as opposed to just the fencing in and keeping of land as wasteland. And this is one of those cases where things are a little fuzzy, and it's one of those points where I think people could get a wedge in to argue against this whole system based on this. In society, it's worth noting that, as I mentioned before, the commons still kind of exist. They exist for the use only of the countrymen of the society that has enclosed those commons. And yeah, they seem to exist as a source of productivity for those who do not as yet have their own land or capital, right? That seems to be Locke's perspective on that. At least that's what I'm getting from the way he's talking about stuff here. Now, I mentioned this already, but we're going to go through it a little bit more carefully because Locke mentions that in society the commons are restricted. You can no longer simply enclose the commons and take them as your own. They have been left open by compact. This is part of what has made the government be a government of an area, is that these places are still commons, but they can no longer be enclosed because in creating a society with limited borders, we have made a situation where there's more people than land, basically. Again, these commons that are inside a society are typically open only to countrymen. I think Locke is kind of overstepping his argument here because it could be possible for temporary, pilgrims or immigrants or temporary guests to use those commons. There's nothing in the law of nature that would necessarily restrict it. And in fact, positive laws of a compact could allow that as well. So he's kind of overstepping a little bit here, but that part we can at least say, okay, yeah, we're going to say that these positive laws that describe how these commons are to be used could include this additional thing that Locke isn't thinking about. However, yeah, so this is also where Locke starts talking about the fact that cultivated land is better than uncultivated land because it produces more, right? And therefore, by way of trade, it gives more wealth to all of humanity as opposed to land that is just kind of sitting there doing nothing. Again, the fact that whatever societal compact is created to create the society area is flexible could lead to conflicts here. And again, Locke is kind of silent about these for the time being. It's also worth noting that the reason that larger holdings than one man can cultivate, are allowed is by compact. Basically, Locke says that in the absence of a societal compact, right, outside of society, you can basically pick up as much land as you can cultivate, and that's it. And he kind of oversteps again by saying that there's no reason for conflict because there's so much land in the commons compared to people at this time that nobody really needs to get in conflict with each other because there's as much and as good land left over. Again, I think this is a little bit little tenuous here. I think he's kind of overstepping again, but once mankind enters into society, Locke notes that certain things such as money start to exist. And what money is to Locke is a good that has value by agreement. Locke is doing something a little funky here. It's worth noting Adam Smith was still working with the labor theory of value as late as 1776 when Wealth of Nations came out, right? And so Locke is also kind of in this primitive understanding of how value theory works. He's working from, but it's interesting that he works not just from a pure labor theory of value, but he also has a little bit of subjective value in there, which I found very interesting. Basically, Locke claims that things like gold and silver have value by mutual agreement of society, which is not quite the same thing as subjective value, that theory, but it is kind of like a very prototypical version of that. Kind of a very primitive version of that, which I think is interesting to see, considering that this book was written and published 80 years before Wealth of Nations, and, a further 100 years after that before the marginal value revolution of Menger and the other two guys whose names I forget. Don't worry about it. Locke notes that in the case of society, I'm quoting here, quote, numbers of men are to be preferred to largeness of dominions, and that the increase of lands and the right employing of them is the great art of government, end of quotation. Locke is basically saying that one of the great purposes of government, of creating society, is to come up with rules to allow mankind to be as productive as possible in that area as possible. Numbers of men are to be preferred to largeness of dominions. That is to say, people might not have enough space to cultivate all the stuff that they need to, feed themselves. But if they have a workshop, then they can produce goods that they can sell in order to get the food that they need to survive. And that's also something that society is there to kind of do, to improve productivity by increasing lands and employing them correctly. Again, this is one of those things where employing land correctly is a very vague statement for something where we're trying to understand a basic theory of property, and we have to be very careful about what Locke means by this. I'm sure we'll get into it more later on, but Locke notes that originally, in the primeval state, which is a combination of the state of nature and the state of war, labor bestowed ownership, but compacts and societies make positive rules to handle property by common consent. So again, Locke is saying, hey, people who are in society, who have agreed to be part of the society, agree to these rules that allow property to be accumulated. This does several things. Basically, what's happening is that free exchange, market exchange, is permitting the extension of property beyond what would be possible in a primeval state. In the primeval state, a man might do something like this. He might take plums that he has that would spoil in a week and trade them for nuts that would stay edible for a year. This would be a perfectly valid thing for a person to do in Locke's state of nature, he says. However, when you have goods that are durable, and one of the things about society is that it promotes the production and accumulation of goods that are durable, then this heaping up of durable things is allowed and is made possible due to money. Basically, I cannot have more of these things than I need to use, more than I can use before they spoil. But I can trade away some of these non-durable goods for durable goods. And the ultimate durable good for Locke, at least in this chapter, is money, is gold and silver. The existence of durable money is proof, Locke says, that mankind agreed to permit such heaping up of goods or land. Now, this is an interesting theory here, because he's basically saying the fact that we have agreed to private property in small transportable objects, non-capital goods, but like precious metals or whatever, means that we can exchange those things in a binding way within society to own more of other durable goods, right? If I have a bunch of gold, I can buy with it a bunch of nuts that are durable goods, or I can buy a bunch of glass, I don't know, that's another durable good. But I can also buy things like land, right? Locke uses this fact of exchange, to justify basically the inequality in wealth that occurs. And this is one of those things where I think he's making a good argument, but he's not giving it enough time to breathe. There are other authors, for instance, I believe it's Nozick, who wrote he wrote an example of that he called that is about Wilt Chamberlain, a rather humorous little anecdote. But basically, Nozick says, well, let's assume hypothetically that all of mankind had equal goods, and yet there was a man, named Wilt Chamberlain, who was especially good at playing basketball. Well, even assuming that everyone started out on equal footing, given the first time that Wilt Chamberlain decides to play basketball and let people, pay for a seat to see him play basketball, Wilt Chamberlain will become exceptionally rich, and everyone else will become slightly poorer, but not, destitute by comparison. Basically, the quest of wealth equality is a fool's errand because it can never be maintained without a constant reconfiscation and redistribution of surplus value created by people's special talents, basically. But Locke is basically getting at the same thing here. The fact that a person can work hard and accumulate gold and then use that gold to buy land within society that is protected by the positive laws of property in that society permit the kind of wealth inequality that we might see in various places. Again, this does not in any sense justify a man using government power to confiscate land or gold or goods from people to use that to enrich himself, but it does justify the kind of free market inequality that we expect to see when free trade is allowed. This is one of those things where, because they don't have a subjective understanding of value yet, they don't have yet the defense to say, they don't yet have the kind of game theory defense that you might see in Rothbard or something like that, where he says, no, this transaction is a person trading something that he values low to someone who values it high, and him getting something that he values high from someone who values it low. It's a mutual gain, not an equal exchange. And so, like, if you want to look up, it's going to be in Man, Economy, and State, or any of Rothbard's discussions on value theory. Maybe I'll try to put one in the description or something. But this is pretty fundamental understanding of how exchange works. And Locke was still operating, I think, in the regime where it was believed that free exchange was the exchange of two things of equal value, where value was something intrinsic to the object. Again, his statement that gold has value by agreement is not a recognition that Alan might value a particular piece of gold highly, and Bob might value that particular piece of gold low, and they might trade something with something else that they value oppositely going in between. Basic exchange is a really important fundamental aspect of modern libertarian theory because of that fact of mutual gain, because of that understanding of subjective value theory. And so this is something that would be worth looking into deeper if you want to get further into that rabbit hole. But Locke is, of course, ignorant of it because he's just 200 years too early. Locke also notes here, and this is one of those other things where I think he's overstepping his bounds, but he says that previous to the existence of money, previous to the existence of durable, tradable goods, there wasn't really much point to a large estate because they would merely spoil and go to waste. Again, I think it's worth noting that for some people, conquest is kind of its own reward. And, it's important for us to not create a system where that kind of... If we allow conquest by violence to be a part of the legitimate, way to build up a society, we've stepped in toward that totalitarian bound, where someone has authority merely because of their willingness and ability to apply violence to those who oppose them. Again, the purpose of Locke's second treatise here is to try to create a government that doesn't do that. And so when he allows for this kind of thing, or when he doesn't properly account for it, when he kind of waves it away, it kind of hurts his argument. At least that's my perspective. it's worth noting here that Locke has again mentioned consent and consent of the governed, but he hasn't yet fully dealt with the situation that he created in an earlier chapter, where Group A puts itself into the state of war with Group B, conquers Group B, and then creates a compact that Group B decides to live under rather than die. Basically, it's one of those things where aggression has that peculiarly one-sided situation going on, where if the assuming arguendo that the aggressors are the bad guys, if the good guys lose, then they might be forced into a situation where they agree to a compact just to not die, right? This is what Locke mentioned in an earlier chapter, that this is kind of the right of conquest. But it's worth noting again that there's a difference between the good guys lose and are dominated, and the good guys win and let the bad guys kind of slink off with reparations alone. If these two situations are not differentiated, as Locke doesn't really differentiate them in his earlier chapter, we create a possible situation where we are forced to recognize consent under duress as the same as real, full-throated, enthusiastic consent. And these two things are not the same. It seems like, right here at this point in the book, it seems like Locke is creating a loophole by which there could be a forceful creation of a caste-based society and forceful recognition of, I guess, what you would call, conquered societies, or societies, where one group has been conquered by another and is absorbed by them. And it's worth noting that such things don't yet seem to violate Locke's precepts, as long as that compact is not inconstant, uncertain, unknown, or arbitrary, right? It could be uneven, it could be unfair, it could be hierarchical, but that is not inconstant, uncertain, unknown, or arbitrary. And therefore we have this sense in which Locke, despite his attempt to create a system that avoids totalitarianism, is basically creating a justification for totalitarianism and for basically the rights of conquest. Again, a state that exists that exists because of such a conquest could be seen as a criminal state by other governments in that society. But again, there's no it gets fuzzier here, where especially after a long period of such, none of the people who were original aggressors still live, and none of the people who are original victims still live. And that's where things can get very, very confusing very fast. So, I hope that this has helped you understand Locke's Chapter 5 of Property. Again, I worry, and I think at this point in the book, it's reasonable to feel like Locke is digging himself into a hole. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to keep going through this, and we're going to have to keep understanding what he's meaning by some particular terms. We've already seen him use peculiar terms in some way. Where Hobbes designates a state of nature, Locke designates a mixture of a state of nature and a state of war. This is one of those things where argument by bizarre definition can result in strange conclusions, and we're going to have to be careful about those, and we're going to have to keep an eye on Locke to make sure he's not accidentally sneaking things in. And we're going to have to also pay attention to the fact that nowadays the religious arguments that Locke is making for certain things they don't really hold that much sway for most people, and certainly don't hold sway for people who follow a different religion entirely. And again, if you want your limited government to be, universalizable, then you're going to need to watch out for these kinds of arguments to make sure that because it seems odd to believe that only a certain particular religious group could have a limited government. It seems almost absurd by stating it. And so, what we need to watch out for are these kinds of leaps of logic, and try to figure out how to mesh them with a more universal understanding of the human condition. So with that, I'll say we are done with chapter 5 for now. Let's see. Chapter 6 is titled Of Paternal Power, and it's another reasonably long one. Locke is now going to start talking about different types of power. Paternal power is the first one he's going to talk about. Then he's going to talk about in Chapter 7 of political civil society. But I think probably we'll just cover Chapter 6 next time as well, because it's a bit of a chunker of a chapter. So, with that said, I hope this is helpful. Again, trying to go through this and understand it as well as where it kind of fails, if it fails somewhere. We're still early in the book, so it may be that Locke ties these things all together in a meaningful way, but we're going to have to see. It's one of those things where maybe where maybe there need to be some amendments to Locke's perspective in order to reach that to reach that limited government state, or it might be that somehow we end up basically saying, well, it seems like logically there is no possibility for a permanent limited state, for a philosophically limited state. And in fact, that might be the case simply because of people's ability to take power without other people noticing. Who knows? Anyway, that's where we're at for now. Chapter 5 of Property. Next up is of Paternal Power. We're just going to keep plugging away at this. So, as always, have a good week. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And we'll have more Locke for you soon. Have a good one.